Hello and welcome to the lecture titled Well-being in Indian Context. This is the second lecture in the trilogy of lectures, or the three lectures, which is devoted on well-being in the Indian context. Um, uh, Historically speaking, from the ancient Indian times to the contemporary times. In this lecture, we are going to look at particularly contributions of Dharma tradition, Mughals, and British colonialism as far as shaping the Indian context or Indian socio-historical context that is marked, as we have seen earlier in the previous lecture, by the notions of relational or relational notions of well-being, besides the social hierarchies that were present simultaneously affecting people's well-being. So let us look at the details of what we are going to learn in this particular lecture. So we'll recapitulate the relational and the hierarchical aspects of well-being in the Indian context. We'll look at dharma. What does it mean? We'll be looking at its meanings and the implications for individual and collective well-being. And we'll be looking at the meanings of dharma from Rig Veda and Bhagavad Gita, and Varna and Ashram systems. Then we'll be moving on to Mughal period and well-being in Islam and devotional tradition. Then British period and influences on well-being after the arrival of or during British colonialism. And we'll be ending the lecture on that. All right. So recapitulating the relational and hierarchical aspect of Indian culture, so we have already seen that there have been strong indications of egalitarian, progressive, as well as exclusionary or divisive ways in which these religio-spiritual traditions have been used, or many of the religio-spiritual traditions have been used in the Indian context historically. Well, shaping well-being as well as, so these traditions have been shaping well-being as well as struggles for well-being amongst the people of India. Example would be caste system in various religious groups that have been existing. Well, coming to the post-Buddhist period, around first millennium in the current era, we find that dharma as a tradition became very important for individual and collective well-being. And as Clark, Deci, and Smith have pointed out, insights about conceptions and lived realities of well-being has been carried out using classical and contemporary literature and analysis of social order or hierarchies from ancient to contemporary times by historians and anthropologists. So, when we talk about dharma, we are not only going to understand the classical literature telling us about Dharma tradition, but also simultaneously the social order that existed in those times, and as pointed out or studied by historians and anthropologists. Well, Dharma, again, according to these literature and according to Clark, Deci, and Smith, it means self assigned duty that a person assigns to oneself, certain duties with the spirit of compassion and empathy, courage and generosity. So we have already started seeing that this religious spiritual tradition of dharma that comes from Rig Veda again has its own transcendental element. So it's not just a duty, but it's a self-assigned duty. And the spirit behind or spirit guiding that internalized duty is compassion, courage, and generosity. And it's just not just limited to one's own benefits or gains in terms of resources or in terms of one's own fulfillment of desires or needs, but It is very much associated with a different conception of one's own nature itself, that how one is associated with or related with the collective, the existence, or the nature. Well, simultaneously, we see that besides such spirit, which is transcendental or egalitarian or spiritual in nature, we also find that dharma has been associated with, intricately associated with Varna. And initially, Varna or categorization on the basis of occupation had its own positive purpose. Well, as per Rig Veda, the four occupational categories of priest, warrior, merchant, and laborer, also known as four varnas or castes, that were based on mythology or cosmology, and it could be invoked to create social order. So it was for the purpose of having some social structure or social order that these varnas were thought about and also practiced. However, early literature, inscriptions, and court documents indicate that this classification was not limited to birth status. So initially in Rig Veda, it was not related to birth status until nearly the end of first millennium current era. So as the time passed around 2000 years later, the Varna system, which was initially based on occupation, it started getting based on the birth status or the family in which the person is born. So, if a person is born in the warrior family or Kshatriya family, the person is taken to be a warrior or a Kshatriya. So, it started happening later, 2000 years after the Rig Veda's conception of Varna. And it very much again was associated with people's well being. So, well being throughout most of South Asian history was more often than not determined by, and I would quote Clark Dacian Smith, the enforced harmony. Please remember this particular phrase, enforced harmony, created by cultural acceptance, although often grudgingly, of the caste system. So, something that initially was there to facilitate human well being with the help of creating certain social order, it became a kind of hierarchy for people as the Verne system started getting converted into not the occupation based categorization, but birth or the family in which you are born. That became the criteria for categorization. And that was also known as the full fledged birth order or birth status related caste system. Where well being is also associated with life stage according to Dharma tradition. And these life stages in the beginning would be studentship or brahmacharya, being a householder, that you are married, and after your studentship, and you have family to take to look after, children to look after. And then later you become a retiree or you start getting closer to the nature in the literal sense that you start living in the forest. In contemporary time, it might not make much sense, but still, it's kind of related to how people start finding more time for one's own um, authentic meaning in life in order to understand one's own sense of the meanings of existence, the purpose of existence, and things like that as one grows older. And then finally, renunciation, which means that one is able to move towards realizing that how one is not simply associated oneself or one sense of self is not just associated with this body or psychological traits, but also uh, the self or our existence could also be related to something that we know as the manifestation of one consciousness or one uh, kind of energy that all of us, in fact, all forms of nature are a manifestation of. So that renunciation again becomes the larger goal in the later life of the person. So that these are the things that were actually put forward in the in the dharma system and ashram system, dharma tradition. Ashram system became one way to look at well-being in different life stages. Well, then Dharma tradition was also associated with Ayurveda or a system of, or a medical system that was indigenous or developed in the Indian context or Indian culture. And it was known as the knowledge of longevity. So, in the first two millennia, current era, emphasized medical as well as, so that medical system was not just about medical or the biological aspects of person's life, but also spiritual or religious aspects of healing of the individual as well as community. So, on one hand, the medical aspect emphasized balancing the three humors or three aspects of person's biological existence, one could say the wind, then bile and phlegm. And we find that although it's beyond the scope of this lecture to go into the details of these three humors or aspects of person's biological existence, still we might see that it does make sense in terms of how this medical system was associated with the whole concept of balancing of various aspects of our existence. Besides that, Ayurveda was an integral part of an ancient and constantly updated cultural system that reinforced allied conceptions of well being. So, for example, these included notions of dharma, which occupied important sections of medical texts and education, notions of destiny and the afterlife that were well attested markers of well-being. So again, what's going to be important is not just balancing of fluid inside the body or aspects of one's biological existence that included wind, bile, and phlegm, but also the whole purpose of life became an important element. The understanding about one's own self, one's own nature, and how is it related to existence or humanity or other forms of nature, that became a marker of human well-being. Or in some sense, the spiritual aspect of one's own life was also taken to be very important in the Ayurveda system. And even today, it has its own implications about human health and well-being is concerned. Well, from there, the Dharma tradition, we move on to the Mughal period, which is well-being in Islam and devotional tradition. We find, for example, we'll be going specifically about the ways in which, in the Mughal period, Islamic religious tradition obviously became an elements, important element of well-being in terms of two basic aspects. One, it had its own ritualistic aspects of worship and rituals. The other thing was related to the spiritual tradition, as we could also see in case of Dharma tradition. So, for Emperor Akbar, in the 16th century, education was related to well being as it not only influenced person's subjectivity, but also the social environment in which he or she lives. So please remember that for Akbar, it might have just been important to follow uh, Islamic understanding, which might be taken to be in terms of certain Islamic laws or rituals to be followed, but he went a bit deeper in trying to understand that how Islam was also related to the spiritual nature of a person, and spiritual goals became, or the humanitarian goals became important in this religious tradition, religious spiritual tradition too. And education was taken to be an important way to pursue that or facilitate that. So therefore, he got implemented not only the traditional religious ritual based education, but gave greater importance to learning processes that could aid students or persons' self discovery. And again, the self discovery has an element of self, and that self is not just taken to be the material biological self, but also a transcendental or spiritual self. So that is something which could be an exemplified, important contribution of Islamic tradition, exemplified in the uh, way Akbar tried to implement such tradition for human well-being. Well, during the same time, we find that Sufism shared a unique otherworldly perspective, which much of North Indian Hindu devotionalism in which religiously guided well being was contingent on generating states of ecstasy or transcendence and rapture through sacred music and modeling one's life on the saints of their tradition. Now, again, saints represented a life that was uh, that was representative of a spiritual or transcendental or relational ways of living one's life. Well, finally, we come to the British period as far as the historical journey that we are taking in trying to understand Indian context and how it shaped well being. And we find that before the British arrived, the well-being was in classical periods and also during the medieval period was more closely determined by stages of life, the independence of local ecology, jungle, savanna, interior or coastal, mountain or plain, the ability to fulfill caste and religious duties and to flow seamlessly through a highly stratified society. And again, I'm quoting Clark, Dacey, and Smith, their work in 2017. And besides that, they point out that the capacity of both individuals and a culture to recover from a specter of early death, even if it may be argued from the medical literature that many of the debilitating diseases that later afflicted the world were not widespread in India. So again, such preventions and such spiritual emphasis in understanding oneself and well-being, despite the presence of hierarchies or restrictive social order, particularly in the last, 1 millennium, more than 1 millennium. So these were the things that shaped human well-being in the Indian culture, which had its own relational as well as restrictive elements of it. However, by the late 18th and early 19th century, Indian economy that also again is related to the material well-being of people had decelerated due to shutting down of Indian textile and other manufacturing industries as the British goods were being made to flow into the Indian market by the British colonial powers. For example, from producing 25% of global industrial goods in the 18th century, I beg your pardon, there is one typographical error there, it should be 18th century. India slipped down to producing only 2% of that in 1900, as far as Clinging Smith and Williamson's studies concerned. Impoverishment did shape people's well being during this period. Again, we are talking about well being and how the traditions, which are religious spiritual traditions, as well as structural or hierarchies related, including British colonialism, produced an economic reality which was that of deprivation. All of it shaped the well-being in the Indian context, and it becomes important that when we talk about well-being in the Indian context, these important aspects of the context, beside the religious spiritual traditions, are also taken into account. In the next lecture, we are going to take up that how in the post-independence period, again the relational as well as the hierarchical elements of Indian context shaped the well-being of people. Thank you very much.